A woman worth $400 million once stood on her father's lawn and told the groundskeeper she would rather die alone than marry a poor man. She did not know he was listening for a different reason than she thought. She did not know her father's will had already decided her future, and she did not know that the quiet man trimming her hedges had once done something far more extraordinary than run a company. If you enjoy stories where pride gets humbled and love gets earned, press subscribe now so you do not miss how this one ends. Vivian Calloway did not raise her voice. She never needed to. When she walked into a room, people adjusted their posture without being told, straightened their ties, stopped checking their phones. She was 34 years old and she ran Calloway Holdings, a logistics and shipping empire her father had built from a single tugboat company into a name that appeared on contracts across 3 continents. She had inherited his sharp eyes and his refusal to waste a sentence. What she had not inherited, people like to whisper, was his warmth. That morning, she had flown in from a shareholder meeting in Chicago that had gone sideways in ways she was still turning over in her mind, and she wanted exactly one thing when she arrived at the family estate outside the city: quiet. Instead, she found a strange truck parked near the carriage house, and a man she did not recognize kneeling in her mother's old rose bed with dirt on his knuckles and a child's laughter drifting from somewhere behind the hedges. She did not like surprises. She had built her entire life around eliminating them, so she crossed the lawn in her heels, arms folded, and asked him who exactly had given him permission to touch her mother's roses. Looked up at her without hurrying, the way a man looks up when he has nothing to prove and no intention of pretending otherwise. He said his name was Ethan Reyes, that her father's longtime groundskeeper had retired in the spring, and that he had been hired to take over the grounds. He said it plainly, without apology, and went back to the soil. She did not like that either. The not hurrying. The not flinching. She told him in the tone she used on vendors who had missed a shipping deadline that she expected the grounds maintained to the standard her father had set, not a standard some stranger invented on his first week. She told him she did not have patience for excuses, and she especially did not have patience for men who thought charm could substitute for competence. He said he was not offering her charm. He said he was offering roses that would survive the winter if she gave him the chance to finish planting them before dark. Something in the flatness of his voice needled her more than any argument could have. She was used to men trying to impress her, or men trying to appease her, or men who wanted something from her family name. This man did neither. He simply kept working, dirt under his nails, sleeves rolled to the elbow, a small girl of maybe 6 sitting cross-legged nearby, stacking pine cones into a wobbling tower. The girl looked up first. She had her father's dark eyes and an openness he clearly worked hard to keep concealed in himself. She asked Vivian if she was a princess, because of the shoes. Vivian almost smiled despite herself, and said no. She was just a woman who was very tired and did not appreciate being ambushed by gardening projects on her own lawn. The girl considered this with the seriousness only small children can manage, and said that her daddy said tired people should not make big decisions. They should eat a sandwich first. Ethan's jaw tightened, the closest thing to embarrassment Vivian had seen from him yet, and he told his daughter, gently, to go finish stacking her pine cones. Vivian watched the exchange longer than she meant to. There was a tenderness in how he redirected the child. No snap in his voice, no impatience, just a low, steady correction, the kind you give someone you trust will listen. She was not used to seeing that. Not from the men in boardrooms who barked into phones while their assistants flinched, and certainly not from the string of polished, ambitious men. Her circle had tried to introduce her to over-the-years, men who complimented her portfolio before they ever complimented her. She told Ethan before she turned to leave that she hoped for his sake the roses lived. He said they would. She said she would be watching. He said, without looking up again, that he was used to that. She did not understand then what he meant. She filed it away as arrogance and walked back toward the house, telling herself she did not care either way. That evening, at a dinner thrown by her Aunt Priscilla for the extended family, someone made the mistake of asking Vivian again why a woman with her success had never settled down. It was a question she had answered 100 times with the same brittle patience. But that night, Perhaps because of the day she'd had, perhaps because of the man kneeling in the dirt with his daughter's laughter behind him, she answered more sharply than usual. She said she would rather run her company into the ground with her own 2 hands than marry a man who could not match her financially or otherwise. She said poverty was not romantic, it was a hazard. And she had watched enough of her father's old friends lose everything to know that love did not pay a mortgage. She said flatly that she would never marry a poor man, not out of cruelty, but out of clarity. And the table had gone quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet, when someone says a true thing too loudly. She did not know that her father's oldest attorney, a soft-spoken man named Walter Higgins, who had drafted 3 generations of Callaway wills, was seated near the end of the table, and that he set down his fork very slowly at the sound of those words. She did not know either that Ethan Reyes, walking past the terrace doors to gather his tools before dark, heard every syllable of it through the open window. He did not react. He picked up his rake, called his daughter's name, and walked toward the truck. But something in his chest had gone tight and cold, an old and familiar ache, the kind a man carries when the past reaches out and taps him on the shoulder uninvited. Because Ethan Reyes had not always been a groundskeeper. 10 years earlier, he had been an engineer, one of the sharpest structural minds to come out of his graduate program, recruited straight into a firm that designed marine terminals and deep-water port systems, the same industry, in fact, that had built the foundation of the Callaway fortune. He had a gift, the kind that made senior partners take notice, for solving problems other engineers walked away from. He had also, at 26, married a woman named Claire, who made him laugh in a way numbers never could, and together they had a daughter, Lily, who arrived loud and furious and perfect. Then Claire got sick. It took 18 months, and it took nearly everything he had, financially and otherwise, and at the end of it he had a 4-year-old daughter, and a stack of medical bills that outpaced his salary twice over, and a grief so heavy he could not make himself walk back into an office building without his hands shaking. So he had done the only thing that made sense to him. He sold the house in the city. He took Lily somewhere quiet. He learned to work with his hands instead of blueprints because Dirt and Roses did not ask him to perform, did not require him to sit in meetings pretending competence when his mind was somewhere else entirely, in a hospital room that no longer existed. He told himself it was temporary. Temporary had become 5 years. What Vivian did not know, what almost no one currently living knew, was the other half of his story. That his father, Daniel Reyes, had once been Charles Callaway's closest friend and earliest business partner, back when Charles was mortgaging his own truck to keep the tugboat company afloat. That the 2 men had built something together in those early years, a partnership sealed on nothing but trust and long nights and shared risk, and that the partnership had ended in a betrayal so old and so quiet that most people had forgotten it ever happened, a falling out over a contract dispute that left Daniel Reyes with nothing and Charles Callaway with everything, and left 2 families that had once shared holidays never speaking again. Ethan had grown up hearing his father's version of it in fragments, bitter and clipped, never the whole truth, just enough to plant a wound that never fully closed. He had grown up poor because of it, in ways Vivian Callaway, with her heated pool and her private jet, could never have imagined. And when Daniel passed, 3 years before Ethan ever set foot on the Callaway estate, he passed with that wound still open, still unresolved, a debt he believed the world owed him and never paid. Ethan had taken the groundskeeper position under his mother's maiden name, quietly, telling himself it was simply the best job available near a good school for Lily, telling himself it meant nothing, that it was the Callaway estate specifically. He had not expected to still feel anything walking those grounds. He had been wrong. He did not tell Vivian any of this. Not yet. He simply kept working, kept his head down, kept driving Lily to school every morning and cooking her dinner every night, and did his job well, because that was the only currency he trusted anymore. 2 weeks after the rosebed conversation, Vivian found herself walking past the greenhouse on her way to a call. She did not want to take, and stopped, because she heard Lily's voice through the glass, asking her father if the flowers missed their mommy in heaven the way she did. Vivian froze on the gravel path, the phone forgotten in her hand. Ethan's voice came low and steady through the glass. He said the flowers did not know about missing, not the way people did, but that he thought maybe they grew a little braver every year because they had practiced coming back, even when the winter had been hard. He said Lily was allowed to miss her mother every single day for the rest of her life, and that missing someone did not mean you were doing something wrong. It meant you had loved someone worth missing. Vivian stood there long after the call she'd meant to take had gone unanswered. She did not know why the words settled into her chest the way they did. She had spent years building walls precise enough that nothing got through them, not her board's criticism, not her aunt's matchmaking, not the loneliness that crept in some nights when the house felt too large and too quiet, but something about a groundskeeper's voice, through greenhouse glass gentle and unguarded, cracked something she had not realized was still capable of cracking. She started finding reasons to walk the grounds more often after that. She told herself it was oversight, due diligence, the kind of attention to detail that had made her company successful. She asked Ethan about drainage near the east lawn, about whether the old oak needed to come down, about the cost of restoring the boathouse dock her father had let fall into disrepair. In his final years, every question, she told herself, was practical. Every answer he gave surprised her. He explained the drainage problem with the calm precision of a man who understood water pressure and soil composition far better than any groundskeeper needed to. He suggested saving the oak with a structural cabling system most arborists would not have thought of. When she mentioned the dock, almost as an aside, he crouched down at the water's edge, studied the old pilings for a long moment, and told her that whoever built it originally had made a small but critical error in load distribution, the kind of flaw that explained exactly why it had started to lean. She asked him, half joking, if he moonlighted. As an engineer, he said nothing for a moment. Then he said only that he used to build things, long time ago, and left it there, the sentence hanging unfinished in a way that made her more curious rather than less. She noticed, too, the way he was with Lily, patient in a manner that had nothing performative about it. One afternoon, Lily fell off the low stone wall near the Kai pond and skinned her knee, wailing the specific outraged wail of a child, more startled than hurt. And Ethan was there before Vivian had even fully registered what happened, kneeling in front of his daughter, voice low, asking her to breathe with him, in slow, before he ever touched the wound. He cleaned it with water from his own thermos, wrapped it in a bandana from his pocket, and told her she was one of the bravest people he knew, which made her stop crying almost instantly and demand to know if that meant she could have ice cream. Vivian, who had grown up with nannies and a father who loved her, by providing rather than by presence, watched the whole scene from the terrace with an ache in her throat she could not name. She began to understand, slowly, and against her own resistance, that the man she had dismissed as beneath her notice possessed something she had never been given and had certainly never learned to offer anyone else. Not money, not status, something quieter than that and harder to buy. It was around this time that Marcus Devereaux began circling. Marcus was her second cousin on her mother's side, and the current chief operating officer of Callaway Holdings, a position her father had given him a decade earlier as a kindness, back when Marcus was floundering after a string of failed ventures. Marcus had repaid that kindness by spending the years since quietly positioning himself as indispensable, cultivating relationships with board members over expensive dinners, always smiling, always agreeable, always one conversation away from being the natural choice if Vivian ever stumbled. Marcus did not like the shift in Vivian's attention. He noticed her asking questions in board meetings that suggested she was more interested in the estate than the last quarter's shipping margins. He noticed through the estate's household staff that she had been seen speaking with the groundskeeper more than the position warranted. And when Charles Callaway's death came, suddenly, a heart attack in his sleep 3 months later, Marcus saw, in the resulting chaos, an opportunity he had been quietly waiting years to seize. The funeral was small, as Charles had requested, held on the estate grounds under the old oak Ethan had saved. Vivian stood through it dry-eyed and rigid, because that was how Callaways grieved in public. And it was only that night, alone in her father's study, surrounded by his ledgers and his old maritime charts, that she allowed herself to break, quietly, into the kind of crying that comes from a place far older than the immediate loss. She did not hear Ethan knock. She heard the door open softly and looked up to find him standing there with Lily's small jacket still draped over his arm, having come to collect his daughter from where she'd been playing with the housekeeper's grandchildren. He saw her face and did not look away, did not offer the empty comfort of a stranger. He simply said he was sorry, that he remembered what it was like to lose someone who had built the entire shape of your world, and that there was no right way to survive the first few weeks of it, only the doing of it, one difficult day after another. She asked him, voice raw, how he had survived his. He said he had not been sure he would. Some days. He said the only reason he kept going was a small girl who needed someone to make her breakfast in the morning, and that sometimes the smallest obligations were the only rope strong enough to pull you through the worst grief. He said he understood, if that was not comfort, but it was the only truth he had. It was, somehow, exactly the comfort she needed. She did not tell him that. Not directly, but she reached out and touched his forearm briefly, and he let her, and something passed between them in that touch that neither one named. The will was read 11 days later, in the same study, with Walter Higgins presiding in his careful, unhurried way, Marcus seated across the table in a suit too sharp for the occasion, and Vivian sitting rigid in her father's old chair, prepared, she thought, for anything. She was not prepared for what Walter read. The bulk of Charles Calloway's fortune, the company, the estate, the shipping contracts built over 4 decades, was to pass to Vivian, in full, under one condition. She was required, within 6 months of the will's reading, to marry Ethan Daniel Reyes, son of Daniel Reyes, or the entirety of the estate would pass instead to a trust benefiting maritime worker charities, with Vivian and Marcus both receiving only a modest, fixed inheritance regardless of the company's actual worth. The room went silent in a way Vivian had never experienced before. Marcus's face went through several colors. Vivian herself simply stared at Walter, waiting for him to say it was some kind of mistake, some clerical error, some cruel joke her father would never have actually written. Walter did not say that. Instead, he set down the papers, folded his hands, and told her the truth her father had asked him to deliver only after his death. He told her that Charles Calloway and Daniel Reyes had once been the closest of friends, that they had built the earliest version of Calloway Holdings together, side by side, on nothing but trust and shared risk. He told her that a contract dispute, decades ago, over a deal Charles had been pressured into by his own father, had ended that friendship in a way that left Daniel Reyes with nothing, and that Charles had spent the rest of his life believing, quietly and privately, that he had done his oldest friend a terrible wrong. He never found the courage to repair while Daniel was alive. He told her that Charles had learned in his final years through channels he never fully explained to Walter that Daniel's son Ethan had walked away from a brilliant engineering career after the death of his wife, and had ended up, through circumstances Charles considered nothing short of fate, in need of exactly the kind of quiet, dignified work Charles could offer without anyone needing to know why. Charles had arranged the groundskeeper position himself under a different surname, specifically, so Ethan would come to the estate without the weight of the Calloway name pressing down on him, so he could be seen for who he actually was, rather than who his father had been. He told her that Charles had watched from a distance as his daughter grew more curious about the man on the grounds, and had come to believe in his final months that here was a chance to correct an old wrong and secure his daughter's future in the same act. He wanted Vivian to marry a man of genuine character, not a man of convenient status, and he had structured the will exactly so that no version of Vivian's usual calculus, wealth, position, appearances could apply. Vivian sat through all of this feeling the floor of her entire identity shift beneath her. Marcus, for his part, erupted, calling the will's condition insane, unenforceable, the product of an old man's failing judgment, and demanded it be contested immediately. Walter, unmoved, informed him that Charles had anticipated exactly this reaction and had the will reviewed and certified by 3 independent legal authorities specifically to withstand a challenge. Marcus stormed from the room, and Vivian understood, watching him go, that she had just made an enemy far more dangerous than she had previously realized he could be. She did not see Ethan for 3 days after that. She did not know how to face him, did not know what to say to a man her father had apparently chosen for her from beyond the grave. A man whose entire history was tangled up with her family's original sin. It was Lily in the end who brought them back together, appearing at the main house's kitchen door, asking if Vivian wanted to see the fort she and her daddy had built out of fallen branches near the greenhouse. Vivian followed the girl out because she did not know how to say no to her, and found Ethan there sawing a branch to size, jaw tight, clearly aware his daughter had orchestrated this and equally clearly unwilling to correct her. They stood there for a long moment, the fort between them, Lily proudly narrating its features, oblivious to the tension threading through the adults above her head. Vivian said finally that she assumed he already knew. He said he had known who her father was. To his father, for most of his life. He said he had not known, until the funeral, that Charles had orchestrated the job specifically, and he had not known anything about the will until Walter called him the previous morning. She asked him if he intended to hold her to it. He said he had no intention of holding anyone to anything. He said he had spent his whole life watching his father hold on to an old grievance until it hollowed him out, and he refused to build his own life or his daughter's on the same foundation of resentment and obligation. He said if she wanted to walk away from the inheritance entirely, he would understand and he would not think less of her. For it, she asked him quietly what he wanted. He was silent long enough that she thought he would not answer. Then he said he did not know anymore, that for years the only thing he had wanted was to keep Lily safe and fed and loved, and he had stopped letting himself want anything beyond that, because wanting things had cost him too much before. But he said, looking at her directly now, that he had noticed things about her in the last few months that did not match the woman she performed for boardrooms and dinner tables, and that whatever this was, he did not think either of them should decide it under the weight of a dead man's conditions. It was, she realized, the same cryptic thread from months earlier, the sentence about being watched, the unfinished admission about building things, all of it circling back to a man who had spent years hiding not just his skills, but his heart, because both had already been broken once. She told him she needed time. He told her she could have all of it she wanted. Marcus did not extend the same patience. In the weeks that followed, he moved with the quiet efficiency of a man who had been planning contingencies for years. He began cultivating doubt among board members, suggesting in low, concerned tones that Vivian's judgment had been compromised by grief, that she was making impulsive personal decisions that threatened to destabilize the company at a critical moment, that a scandal involving the family estate's groundskeeper would embarrass Callaway Holdings in front of international partners who valued discretion above all else. He found or manufactured a story that Ethan had falsified his employment history, that the groundskeeper position had been obtained under false pretenses, that the man was, in Marcus's carefully chosen words to a reporter he'd cultivated for exactly this purpose, a grifter who had wormed his way into a grieving woman's household staff, and then into her father's dying manipulated wishes. The story broke 2 days before a scheduled board vote on a major port expansion deal. Vivian had spent 18 months securing a deal. Marcus had quietly worked to undermine from the inside, feeding selective information to the partner company that made Vivian's leadership look erratic. Vivian arrived at the office that morning to find the story already circulating. Reporters camped near the building entrance. Board members' assistants calling to reschedule meetings in the careful, evasive language people use when they are preparing to abandon someone. She found Ethan in the estate's toolshed that evening, methodically sharpening a set of pruning shears, with a focus that told her he already knew. She asked him if it was true, not because she believed Marcus, but because she needed to hear the actual truth from him directly, all of it, everything. He had never told her, and so, for the first time, he told her everything. The engineering firm, the marine terminal designs that had once carried his name on patents worth more than most people saw in a lifetime. Claire, and the 18 months that took her, and the 4-year-old girl who had needed him to still be a father, even when he did not know how to be a person. He told her he had walked away from an industry that had once considered him one of its brightest minds, because grief had made the work impossible, and because he had decided, in the wreckage of it, that being present for Lily mattered more than being celebrated for anything else. He told her the groundskeeper position had never been a lie. Not really, only an incomplete truth, and that he understood if incomplete truths were something she could not forgive, given everything her family had just been through. She told him she did not need him to be forgiven. She told him she needed him to help her save a deal that Marcus was actively sabotaging, using exactly the kind of technical engineering knowledge Marcus assumed a groundskeeper could never possess. He asked her for the first time since she'd known him if she was certain. She said she had never been more certain of anything, and that certainty, coming from her, meant something entirely different than it would from anyone else. The board meeting was moved up at Marcus's insistence to capitalize on the scandal while it was still fresh. He arrived that morning, radiating the particular confidence of a man who believes he has already won, prepared to present evidence of Ethan's supposed fraud, prepared to paint Vivian as a woman whose judgment could no longer be trusted with the company her father built. What Marcus did not know was that the port expansion deal hinged on a technical dispute the partner company had raised about structural load calculations for a new terminal design. A dispute Marcus had deliberately obscured from Vivian, feeding her incomplete data designed to make her look unprepared in front of the partners. Vivian stood at the head of the boardroom table, board members watching her with the wary, assessing look of people waiting to see which way to jump, and she did not flinch. She told them that the reports about Ethan Reyes were not merely incomplete. They were a deliberate distortion, orchestrated by someone inside the company who benefited directly from her failure. She told them that Ethan Reyes held 2 patents in marine terminal engineering, patents that predated his employment on her estate by nearly a decade, and that the very structural dispute currently threatening to collapse their port expansion deal was a problem he had already identified and solved weeks earlier. In a casual conversation she had initially dismissed as small talk. She gestured, and Ethan stepped forward from where he had been standing quietly near the door, dressed simply. No suit, no performance, carrying nothing but a folder of hand-drawn calculations, and a calm, unshaken bearing that filled the room more completely than Marcus's expensive tailoring ever had. He walked the board through the load distribution error in the proposed terminal design with the same unhurried clarity he had once used to explain drainage patterns on her lawn, and it took less than 10 minutes for 2 engineers on the partner company's side, present via video call, to confirm that he was not only correct but had identified a flaw their own team had missed entirely, a flaw that would have caused significant structural failure within 5 years of construction. The room's mood shifted so fast it was almost audible. Marcus, sensing the ground disappearing beneath him, tried to pivot, tried to argue that regardless of technical merit, the appearance of impropriety remained, that Vivian's personal entanglement with an employee represented a governance risk the board could not ignore. It was Walter Higgins, called in that morning at Vivian's request, who delivered the final blow. He informed the board in his same unhurried, careful tone that he had spent the previous week conducting a routine audit of recent expense reports at Vivian's request and had discovered a pattern of falsified consulting invoices, funds funneled through shell arrangements Marcus had used to pay the very reporter who broke the story, and further evidence that Marcus had deliberately withheld the technical data that led to the board's confusion over the port deal in the first place. The silence that followed was total. Vivian did not raise her voice, because she never needed to. She simply told the board that she would be recommending Marcus Devereaux's immediate removal as Chief Operating Officer, effective that morning, and that she trusted the board to see, now, exactly who had been protecting the company's interests and who had been sabotaging them for personal gain. The vote was unanimous. Marcus was escorted from the building within the hour, his allies among the board evaporating with the particular speed of people who had only ever been loyal to power, not to him. The story that broke the following day told a very different narrative, one of a groundskeeper's hidden brilliance, a company saved from internal betrayal, and a woman whose judgment had been vindicated rather than questioned. Ethan was offered, within the month, a formal position as head of infrastructure engineering for Callaway Holdings, overseeing exactly the kind of terminal and port design work he had once walked away from. He accepted, but only after negotiating terms himself, terms that guaranteed he would never be required to travel more than one night at a time, that he could work remotely on the estate grounds when Lily was out of school, that his schedule would always, without exception, allow him to be the one who picked her up. Vivian, for her part, began making changes to the company that surprised even her oldest board members. She restructured parental leave policies. She refused, for the first time in her tenure, to approve a merger that would have required layoffs timed specifically to avoid severance obligations. She started asking, in meetings, not just whether a decision was profitable, but whether it was decent, and found to her quiet surprise that the two were not as often in conflict as she had once assumed. It was several weeks later, on an ordinary evening with no scandal pending and no board vote looming, that she found Ethan back at the same rose bed where they had first argued, kneeling in the dirt exactly as he had that first day, though this time Lily sat beside him instead of a few feet away, small hands cupped around a trowel, far too big for her. Vivian sat down on the low stone edge of the bed, not caring about her clothes in a way the old version of her would have found unthinkable, and asked him if the roses had made it through the winter after all. He said they had. He said most things, given enough patience and the right conditions, tended to survive longer than people expected. She asked him about the sentence he had said to her, all those months ago, the one about being watched, the one she had never fully understood. He was quiet for a moment, working the soil between his fingers, and then he said that he had meant, back then, that he had been watched and judged his whole life for things that were never entirely his fault: his father's poverty, his own grief, the assumptions people made about a man who worked with his hands, and that he had grown so used to bracing for that judgment that he had almost missed the moment when she stopped offering it. She said she was sorry it had taken her so long to see him clearly. He said she had seen him clearly before she realized it, in the greenhouse, at the koi pond, in 100 small moments neither of them had named at the time. Lily, without looking up from her trowel, announced that she thought Vivian should just marry her daddy already, because he made really good pancakes, and Vivian looked like she needed more pancakes in her life. Ethan's ears went faintly red, and Vivian, for the first time in longer than she could remember, laughed. A real laugh, unguarded and surprised out of her. She told Lily she would take that under serious consideration. She and Ethan did not marry that week, or the next. They took the time her father's will had never actually forced them to skip, weeks that turned into months, dinners at the estate, quiet mornings where Ethan taught her, badly and patiently, how to identify which plants needed pruning and which needed only to be left alone to find their own shape. She learned that trust, unlike a shipping contract, could not be rushed into existing through sheer force of will, and that some of the most valuable things in her life so far had come not from her competence but from her willingness. Finally, to be patient with something she could not fully control. When they did marry, quietly, on the estate lawn, under the old oak Ethan had once saved from being cut down, Lily stood between them, holding a small basket of rose petals, from the very bed her father had once been so contemptuous of, now grown thick and full and stubbornly alive. Charles Calloway had written his will, believing he was correcting an old debt, restoring what his own long-ago betrayal had cost, a friend he never stopped loving. He could not have known precisely how it would unfold, could not have guaranteed that his daughter would learn to see past the wealth she'd been raised to value above everything else, or that the son of his oldest friend would learn to trust the world again after it had taken so much from him. But he had understood in his final years the one thing that mattered most, that some inheritances are not measured in dollars, and that the truest wealth a person can hand down is the chance for someone they love to be seen, finally, for exactly who they are,